He who passively accepts evil is as much involved in it as he who helps to perpetuate it. He who accepts evil without protesting against it is really cooperating with it. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. These words by Dr. King, though originally used with reference to the evil of racism, essentially state that to be passively acceptant of evil is to cooperate with it. Put another way, complacency in the face of evil is complicity with evil. These are powerful words that Dr. King understood very well. Great courage was required during the 1950s and 60s to stand against overwhelming odds in the face of the evil called racism. Courage is something that historically has been in large supply in America. Acts of heroism are replete throughout American history. This is undoubtedly because of our Christian faith and heritage. After all, courage does not come from Satan. Courage comes from God, which is why the Bible repeatedly admonishes believers to be strong and courageous, knowing that heaven is with you. But can you imagine the courage it would take for 13 colonies to stand up to the world's military superpower of the time? Can you imagine the courage it took for the signers of the Declaration of Independence to actually affix their names to a document enshrining their rebellion to the king? This was an act of treason of the highest order that would be certainly met with swift action and certain death by execution and perhaps torture. But how did the colonies get there? The seeds of revolution. In 1763, Great Britain defeated the French in the French and Indian War, a war that began in 1754 and ended 9 years later. This conquest gave Britain all of North America, including Canada. However, the downside was the war was very expensive and almost bankrupted England. Therefore, Parliament and King George III determined that the cost of the war would be recouped by a series of taxes that would be imposed on the colonies. But this irritated and enraged the colonists, who resented the idea of being taxed to pay for England's debts without having any representation in Parliament. This led to a series of political protests and revolts, which included the infamous Boston Tea Party, where the Sons of Liberty, a group of colonial patriots who staged a very orderly protest that culminated in 342 chests of tea being dumped into Boston Harbor. This infuriated King George and Parliament, and in turn led to the Intolerable Acts, which were a series of punitive laws enacted by Parliament in 1774 after the Boston Tea Party, and meant to punish the colonists in Massachusetts for their open defiance of the Crown. The Boston Port Act closed Boston Harbor until the tea lost in the Boston Tea Party was paid for. The Massachusetts Government Act overhauled the town charter, called for all local judges and officials to be appointed by the governor, and outlawed large gatherings. The Administration of Justice Act stipulated that any British official charged with a capital offense would have their trial moved to England, where a friendlier jury would hear the case. The Quartering Act followed and allowed newly posted British troops sent to maintain order to be quartered in the homes of private American citizens. And finally, the Quebec Act, which stripped newly acquired and expanded territories from the colonies and gave much of it to Quebec in Canada. These intolerable acts led to great unrest in the colonies as other states began to coalesce around their sister state, Massachusetts. Incidentally, this coalescing could have never happened in the colonies were it not for the Great Awakening, which had the effect of unifying the colonies around God as their common Father. The colonial response to these acts was to encourage all Americans to, 1, disobey the intolerable acts, 2, stop paying taxes, and 3, prepare for war. Then in 1774, a group of delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies met in Philadelphia in order to coordinate the resistance. This was the first Continental Congress. However, their objective at this point was not to declare their independence, but rather to reconcile with England. This led to the Olive Branch Petition being sent to King George III to avert an escalation of hostilities. But just like Pharaoh of old, his heart was hardened against the colonies. The king refused reconciliation and instead, determined to teach the rebels a lesson, sent British warships and hired mercenaries to go to war with the American colonies. The die was now cast and war was inevitable. When war is inevitable. During the interim before the British Armada arrived, the Continental Congress appointed George Washington as the commander of the Patriot forces. But realizing that they would need help and foreign support, they reached out to France requesting aid. This was an enemy of my enemy is my friend moment in history. But before the French would commit to help America, they required the colonies to demonstrate their resolve. So on July 4th, 1776, 56 congressional delegates signed the Declaration of Independence, which reads in part, the Declaration of Independence. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. This document signed the founders' death warrants if they were ever caught. Now they were totally committed to the cause and to one another. One of their constant fears was that if one person were captured, they would be tortured until they renounced the cause and weakened the resolve of the other signers, potentially destroying the very coalition that they had so tenuously put together. David versus Goliath. When the British Armada arrived off the coast of New York, There were over 400 battleships, outnumbering the colonials 2-1. 32,000 British troops began to prepare to storm New York. If there was ever a David versus Goliath situation in war, this was it. The colonials were outnumbered, outgunned, and in every way that they could be an underdog, they were. In fact, just 5 of the British battleships had more firepower than all the Patriot artillery in the city. And there were over 400 ships. In every way, this invasion was unprecedented. In fact, it would prove to be the most significant attack on New York until September 11, 2001. Then the cannons began to fire. In only an hour, 2,500 cannonballs rained down from the sky with the intention of completely annihilating the American forces. Then 6,000 British troops stormed Manhattan Island. These battle-hardened soldiers had 6 times more military experience than their American counterparts. After losing many valiant soldiers, General Washington gave the order to retreat, and New York fell to the British, who began burning the city. A peek behind the veil. While in the natural, this was a very stressful time for all of the colonies. They did have one thing on their side. During the time leading up to this conflict, the Continental Congress had repeatedly called for national days of humiliation, fasting, and prayer. This happened repeatedly with certain regularity during moments of crisis in the time leading up to this fateful moment. And just prior to this impending conflict, on May 15th, 1776, General George Washington ordered the entire army to comply with a time of fasting and prayer. In a letter, he addressed his men by saying, "The Continental Congress, having ordered Friday the 17th to be observed as a day of fasting, humiliation, and prayer, humbly supplicate the mercy of Almighty God, that it would please him to pardon all our manifold sins and transgressions, and to prosper the arms of the United Colonies, and finally establish the peace and freedom of America upon a solid and lasting foundation. The General commands all officers and soldiers to pay strict obedience to the orders of the Continental Congress, that by their unfeigned and pious observance of their religious duties, they may incline the Lord and giver of victory to prosper our arms." What happens when a nation cries out to God? When an entire nation cries out to God with humility, repentance, prayer, and fasting, though you may not be able to see anything in the natural realm, a shift happens in the supernatural realm that causes strange and unexplainable things to occur in the natural realm. The first battle of the Revolutionary War in Brooklyn Heights, New York. Greatly outnumbered, Washington expected an attack from the sea, where the harbor was filled with 400 ships. But a British loyalist living in America led 10,000 British troops at night through Jamaica Pass to attack the Continental Army from behind on August 27th, 1776. This was the largest battle of the Revolutionary War and engaged the entire American army. This meant that there would be no reinforcements that would come to General Washington's aid or rescue. A complete loss here would have completely ended the war decisively, which is exactly what King George and his generals wanted. During this battle, America lost 3,000 men as compared to only 300 British troops. The intervention of heaven. After battling all day, Washington was trapped with 400 ships behind him and 10,000 British troops in front of him, and seemingly no way to retreat. The sad prospect that loomed over America was that Washington would most likely be captured and hung for treason, along with all of the founding fathers, and America would permanently become a British colony and subjects of the crown. But before a British victory could be seized, a torrential rain halted the battle. Eyewitness testimonies from both sides said that it was a storm unlike anything they'd ever seen. It was like a hurricane with lightning strikes on every side. A Connecticut major named Abner Benedict watched the spectacle in awe from his post. He says, thunder crashed louder than 1,000 cannons, and in a few minutes the entire heavens became black as ink, and from horizon to horizon the sky was ablaze with lightning. Another witness testified that the great cloud appeared to stand still and swing round and round like a horizontal wheel. This terrifying display continued for more than 3 hours. Lightning strikes set various homes on fire. People were also struck with lightning. A soldier who appeared to have no physical injuries was struck deaf, dumb, and blind. An entire camp with 2 lieutenants was killed with 1 lightning bolt. But this weather anomaly gave Washington and his troops precious time to regroup. It was then that he had an idea. He would gather every boat he could find during the cover of night and ferry his troops across the East River to Manhattan Island. However, with only half the army moved by the time dawn came, Major Ben Talmadge, Washington's chief intelligence officer, wrote, "As the dawn of the next day approached, those of us who remained in the trenches became very anxious for our own safety, and when the dawn appeared, there were several regiments still on duty." At this time, a very dense fog began to rise off the river, and it seemed to settle in a most peculiar manner over both encampments. I recollect this peculiar providential occurrence perfectly well, and so very dense was the atmosphere that I could scarcely discern a man at 6 yards distance. We tarried until the sun had risen, but the fog remained as dense as ever. Washington was on the last boat that left Brooklyn Heights. When he was safely on Manhattan Island, the fog lifted and the British troops attacked. But to their overwhelming consternation, no one was there, as the American army had escaped. This would prove to be the only opportunity Great Britain ever got to capture the entire American army at one time. Washington later wrote his brother, "The hand of Providence has been so conspicuous in all this, the course of the war, that he must be worse than an infidel that lacks faith. But it will be time enough for me to turn preacher when my present appointment ceases." Furious at their failure, the British invade Philadelphia, and the Continental Congress is forced to flee for their very lives, giving their last instruction, "Until Congress shall otherwise order, General Washington shall be possessed of full power to order and direct all things." Thus, the entire experiment and future of America would now rest on the shoulders of one man. But it just so happened that this one man believed in the power of prayer and had experienced the divine hand of providence before. Therefore, he was not afraid to demand that his entire army cry out to the God of the universe for favor and divine help. Courage in the face of tyranny. The American colonies looked tyranny in the eyes and decided to fight against it. It was the devout Christian and attorney Patrick Henry whose bold, passionate statement communicated the sentiments of all patriots when he said, "Give me liberty or give me death." Today we live in a time where enemies of freedom want to take our rights as citizens away. Tyrannical mayors, governors, and politicians are seizing power that the Constitution never gave them by capitalizing on the fear that has been perpetrated upon society. Furthermore, there are those who are calling for a radical change of government, desiring to plunge this country into a socialistic nightmare. But socialism has never worked anywhere in history. In fact, everywhere that it has been tried, those countries were transformed into tyrannical and oppressive societies that have been responsible for killing over 100 million people. Yet our young people have been brainwashed by a wicked and insidious educational system into believing that socialism is good and America is bad. We must stand up and be counted. We must stand against the tyranny and indoctrination of our day that seeks to force us into compliance and acquiescence to the doctrines of transgenderism, homosexuality, critical race theory, lawlessness, and dishonoring law enforcement, and so many other purely wicked and evil ideologies that are being propagated in the culture. Well, if this has blessed you, and I pray that it has, would you give it a thumbs up by clicking the like button? Also, post your comments and questions in the comments section below. Thank you so much for your time. It is my great honor to speak into your life. And with God's grace, we will transform believers into kingdom citizens that represent heaven while living right here on earth. Thank you so much for your time. I look forward to continuing this journey with you.